Section 3. The Medieval Period. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, Europe entered a fragmented and uncertain age, one where nature was no longer a source of pleasure, but a force to be feared, tamed, and reconciled with. This was the medieval period, a time of castles and cloisters, of moats and monasteries. And yet, it is in this era that we find a quiet, profound shift in the human relationship to landscape. It is here that we begin to see the garden not only as a practical necessity, but as a symbolic reflection of the divine, an echo of Eden, carefully enclosed, cultivated, and contemplative. Monastic gardens, paradise recreated. In the early Middle Ages, monasteries became sanctuaries of knowledge, healing, and agriculture. Within their walls, the garden took on sacred dimensions, an earthly expression of cosmic order. These were the hortus conclusus, enclosed gardens, places of silence, healing, and self-sufficiency. Their design followed the ideals of sacred geometry, quadripartite layouts representing the four rivers of paradise, or the four cardinal directions, always centered, always balanced. The Benedictine rule, ora et labora, pray and work, made gardening a daily act of devotion. Monks like Walafrid Strabo, in his 9th century poem Hortulus, described his herb garden not only with botanical detail, but with spiritual affection. Hildegard of Bingen, abbess and mystic, saw the earth as a living organism. Her healing gardens reflected her belief that nature, when respected and understood, could bring us closer to God. These gardens were rich with plants like sage, rosemary, lavender, fennel, useful, symbolic, and ecologically functional. They provided food, medicine, and meaning. Sites like the Abbaye de Saint-André in France or the Monastery of St. Gallen in Switzerland still echo these ancient rhythms. Castle gardens, landscapes of power and protection. Outside the monasteries, a different kind of garden evolved, one forged by feudalism, warfare, and territorial power. Castles were not just military strongholds. They were complex landscapes with layers of defense, sustenance, and status. Moats, orchards, vineyards, and enclosed gardens surrounded these stone fortresses, offering both strategic visibility and vital resources. Gardens like those at Château de Languilles, Warwick Castle, or Burg Eltz were less about reflection and more about survival and control. Yet even here, we see the seeds of future design traditions. Hunting parks for the nobility, fish ponds for food and irrigation, and small pleasure gardens tucked into walls, offering moments of beauty amidst fortification. These were early attempts to choreograph wilderness, to mediate between the wild and the walled, a theme we will see again and again in the evolution of landscape design. Islamic influence, paradise in geometry and water. While Christian Europe built its gardens for prayer and power, a parallel vision flourished in Al-Andalus, medieval Islamic Spain. Here, gardens like those of the Alhambra and Generalife in Granada reflected an exquisite balance of architecture, water, and plant life. Rooted in Quranic descriptions of paradise, these spaces were defined by enclosed symmetry, flowing water, shade, and sensory delight. Designers used channels, rills, and pools to cool and irrigate, while trees, citrus groves, and flowering vines created a living tapestry of scent and sound. These were not wild gardens, but carefully designed microclimates, using passive cooling, spatial layering, and deep symbolism. The influence of Islamic garden philosophy would quietly seep into European design through Spain, Sicily, and the Crusades, enriching the fabric of medieval landscape thinking. Artistic symbolism and landscape. Medieval art offers another view of how people related to land, not through realism, but through allegory. In illuminated manuscripts and books of hours, we see the Garden of Mary enclosed in a walled space, a metaphor for purity. In tapestries like the Lady and the Unicorn, we see animals, flora, and myths woven into fantasy landscapes. Gardens were both physical and metaphysical. The land was a moral terrain, filled with signs, symbols, and seasons, not yet a subject, but always a backdrop to higher meaning. Enclosure, order, and the early foundations. Beneath the walls and rituals, the medieval garden was a world of structure and symbolism. These spaces were not intended to evolve freely. They were designed to maintain order, to reflect a vision of harmony that echoed divine perfection. Gardens were prescriptive, following patterns passed down through scripture, monastic rule, or military logic. From the cloisters of Hildegard's abbey to the castle orchards and hunting forests, landscape was seen as something to be enclosed, organized, and maintained, much like medieval painting, with its symbolic forms and flattened space. Change in these landscapes came slowly, subtly, through seasonal tasks like pruning, grafting, composting, or rotating crops. But the guiding vision was of stability, of a world held together by spiritual and hierarchical structure. And yet, within these constraints, we begin to see early signs of ecological thinking, careful plant selection, water reuse, soil care, integrated systems. Though not framed in modern terms, these gardens were quiet experiments in survival, adaptation, and long-term care. Still, the medieval vision of landscape was one of containment, not freedom, a sacred enclosure echoing a cosmological ideal. It is only later, with the Renaissance and beyond, that the landscape begins to be seen as something more dynamic, more expressive, more open. And so we leave the medieval period standing at a threshold, between sacred prescription and the first stirrings of observation, between divine order and a new curiosity about nature itself. Because if we are to understand designing landscapes as evolutionary systems, we must first recognize the moment when the garden began to shift from fixed icon to living canvas. If you enjoyed this journey, like, subscribe, and join us for more. This series is a special project by LASD Studio. Landscape architecture, sustainability, and design, offering thoughtful, site-specific design services around the world. Visit us at lasstudio.com to learn more. Let's keep walking together through the living history of landscape, where art, nature, and human spirit continue to meet.